Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. Should mayors rule the world? Dr. Benjamin Barber thinks so, and his latest book lays out his reasons why. It's called If Mayors Ruled the World, and I'm glad it brings him back to the Grit TV studios. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Laura. Great to be with you on Grit TV again.
All right, so Ben, lay out your case. Why should mayors rule the world?
Well, first of all, what I'm doing is changing the subject, because for 400 years, when we talk about democracy, we talk about global governance, we talk about war and peace, we talk about poverty and inequality, we talk about nation states. And the argument I'm making, which isn't very hard to persuade people of, is that nation states are increasingly dysfunctional, not just because of the ideological gridlock we're experiencing in the US and in places like England and Italy and Spain are problems also, but because the long independent sovereignty of nation states is increasingly unaccommodating of the interdependent challenges of a global world. In other words, every challenge we face, whether it's environmental change, whether it's disease, whether it's terrorism, whether it's global markets, whether it's immigration, you name it, is global, international, cross-boundary. And the institutions, the political institutions we address these 21st century interdependent problems with are 17th century independent nation states. So in that asymmetry lies the problem for which the city is the solution.
What about the numbers? How many of us now live in cities, and what are you proposing for those who don't?
The real issue is that right now, the urban population of the developed world is 78% of the population. They don't control anything like 78% of the funds, the agenda, or the 80% of GDP that cities produce. They're not allowed to and haven't been able to deal with the 80% of carbon emissions that come out of cities. The global figure now, just 2 years ago, passed the 50% mark. Even in the developed world, more than half of the population lives in cities, and it's more and more every year. We are, as Ed Glazer said, an urban species. We are moving to cities, and right now cities are underrepresented in global affairs and in their own agendas.
Now, what's your proposal? You're looking for actual parliament of mayors, as I understand it.
Well, I'm looking for two things. I am looking for an acceleration, intensification, and above all, recognition of what cities are already doing together. There are at least 24 global organizations, none of which anyone's ever heard of. If we ask the audience here, who's heard of the UN? Yes. Who's heard of the World Bank? Yes. Who's heard of even the League of Nations or the Concert of Europe? Yes. Now, who has heard of the UCLG, United Cities and Local Governments? It's the most important institution in the world nobody's ever heard of.
What do they do?
It's an organization of over 3,000 cities that meets annually and is in touch all the time around common solutions, common problems, common challenges. It is already a UN of cities. My proposal for a global parliament of mayors is to kind of put a keystone in the arch of inner city associations that is already out there, to put a megaphone in front of the voice of cities. We know voice is a very large question in democracy. And cities, the voice of cities is underrepresented, little heard. Mayors, we just saw it here with de Blasio in New York, with Garcetti in LA, with Walsh in Boston, with George Ferguson in Bristol, the first elected mayor in England. These are people who represent a new and fresh political voice in the constituents of their cities. A global mayor's parliament puts a megaphone in front of the voice of the city and lets the world public opinion hear it.
Well, let's face it, there is a diversity of voices when we talk about mayors. And you talked about New York and de Blasio. De Blasio ran on being an alternative to the mayor that preceded him, Michael Bloomberg. This is one of the things that Tish James, our new public advocate, said during her inauguration this January. Take a look.
The policies that make them voiceless must give way to a government that works for them, that speaks for them, that cares more about a child going hungry than a new stadium or a new tax credit for a luxury development.
So what about that? I mean, Mayor Bloomberg had a very clear agenda, but a lot of people would say he was more monarch than mayor, not that democratic.
Well, he wasn't, and one of the things we have to be careful of is not just monarchs, but benevolent monarchs. A lot of the things he did, whether it was about smoking or about obesity in children, were probably good things a lot of progressives would approve of, but he never bothered to get his constituents and the supports of the constituencies that should have and would have supported it, and as a result, a lot of the changes won't hold. So reach out, participation is absolutely crucial. But here's the issue that Tisha James addresses, and that is really the challenge for cities. Inequality, growing inequality in the city and indeed in nation states as well is perhaps our foremost problem next to climate change. I put that first because we won't have a globe to deal with inequality and if we don't deal with climate change. But second comes inequality. Here's the great paradox that mayors and cities face, and even Bloomberg faced, certainly de Blasio faces. Inequality in the city is the consequence of causes over which cities have no control.
That's right.
Global capitalism, global markets, global corporations, global banks, and all the problems that global capitalism creates. We know it's an extraordinarily productive system of wealth and extraordinarily poor at distributing that wealth and not very good anymore at jobs because jobs aren't necessarily in the interest of the profits of stakeholders. So cities are forced to deal with the consequences of global inequalities that come out of global capitalism without the ability to directly regulate or affect or deal with the global corporations and so forth that are there. And that's true no matter whether the mayor's de Blasio or Bloomberg or Walsh or anybody else.
So what can cities do?
So the question is, what can cities do? And there are two important things. And Letitia, in her wonderful speech, made it clear, she talked a lot about voice. There are two aspects to inequality in a democracy. One is wealth. But wealth and education are important because they impact voice. Something that de Blasio has already done and that Ms. James is doing and others in the new administration are doing is saying, here's a microphone, we want you to have a voice in this city's affair. Part of that comes from outreach, part of that comes from participatory things like participatory zoning, participatory budgeting, but a large part comes from speaking for and also allowing those peoples to speak for themselves. Voice is very important. But the other thing is there are a great many measures that can be taken in the city that ameliorate inequalities whose causes you still can't do.
Well, so let's talk about some of those. I mean, if we were to make stronger local economies, and this question of localism is something I want you to address because that's the direction that so much policy is going and so much of our culture is going, to celebrate the locally produced food, the local project, the local company. You're suggesting going global, which seems to be in the
local and global, glocal. I'll come back to glocal, a great word that suggests both devolving down and evolving up at the same time.
All right, but would you agree there's an interest in having a strong local economy,
no
one that serves the people that live
it. And
in the community?
Here's the point. There are all kinds of leverages. The problem I have with Bloomberg is not necessarily that he gave full rein to real estate industry and the finance industry, because that certainly added to the prosperity and wealth of New York, even though only for some, not all.
And his language was always we were competing with other cities, with
we'll
Singapore, with London, and all the rest.
But the other part of the problem with what he did is he asked nothing from those who benefited from his policies.
That's right.
Now, take affordable housing. He let the real estate industry run wild, and I think what he needed to have said is, you can't run wild, but you can run. But if you're going to run, you have to walk holding hands with affordable housing, building units for those who can't afford it. In other words, he never made a quid pro quo, so much affordable housing for so much luxury housing and so on. So he gave them a free ride.
Let's talk about global corporations. It seems to me that it's hard enough for the nation state government, Washington, say, or London, to assert itself against the power of certain massive world corporations. What would be the power of mayors up against, well, treaties like the Trans-Pacific Partnership that will make it very hard for some of these initiatives you're talking about, whether it's about global climate change or wages or mandatory affordable housing, to take effect?
One by one, cities will even have a harder time, as you say, than states together, and that's where intercity cooperation, that's where intercity associations, that's where a global parliament of mayors could play a vital role. Because if cities worldwide control 80% of GDP, 78% of population in the West, 52% of population worldwide growing every year, they are in a position democratically to take on corporate wealth in a way that states are not. Particularly, cities are less vulnerable to that because there's more transparency, there's more direct access to power in cities, and because when cities act together globally, they are positioned to do something about it.
Because we're seeing fights over things like campaign financing, where cities try to impose or install a public financing rule. That's challenged in the courts. Even local procurement, buying locally, is challenged in the courts, even at the international courts.
Now you move, Lord, to the most important question, the character of federalism and of city-state national relations, and that's true whether it's Canada or Mexico or Germany or here. you know, if indeed I'm right and cities are more progressive, they're doing good things, they represent the majority of the population worldwide, and they're trying to change things, how can they do that if they remain inferior subsidiary jurisdictions to states and nations that still have sovereignty? Yeah. Because though sovereignty is a failing principle with respect to the control of nations over their cities, it's not a failing principle, it's there. Nobody can defy it. So the real question is, how can cities together make progress against the reality of the sovereignty of the states they're in? And my answer there is an old answer: democracy. In the United States, 70 or 80% of people live in cities. We need to give them a voice in national politics. If cities controlled Washington, Washington would not be in the mess it is today. It's precisely because cities and their majority populations don't control Washington, don't control the Senate, don't control the gerrymandered, rigged House, that we have the problem we do. So my answer is, the way you deal in a democracy with the jurisdiction of states over cities is to reverse that jurisdiction democratically and politically, make sure that cities and their 3/4 of the population control the states.
You've got some great stories about mayors in the books. Pick your favorite.
Mayors are different than national politicians. They traffic not in ideology, but in solving problems. They have to be pragmatists. They have to get things done.
You have a great line where you say, the nation state isn't it, but the city is us.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really, really important. Cory Booker, before he went to the Senate in Newark, New Jersey, was known for, on his way to work, stopping, getting out of his car, going into a burning house and pulling out a couple guys who were overcome by smoke. Now, no president or prime minister would be allowed to do that, and would be unlikely to. But you know why? Because mayors are homies, homeboys and homegirls. They're from the neighborhood. They're neighbors spending time as governors, and that means they're always from the city. You can't parachute in, you can't carpetbag a mayorship. You can do that in the government, you can do that in the Senate. You cannot do it.
It's harder. You say at the end of your book, cities can heal themselves, and I want to come back to what do you think are the top 3 things city government can be doing to make a difference at this level?
Can cities heal themselves? Yes, they can, because of what makes a city. And what makes a city, and Richard Florida has said this and others have argued it, cities are about density, creativity, autonomy, transparency, mobility, openness, diversity, the diversity and multiculturalism of cities.
The mix that Jane Jacobs talked about.
And that's what makes cities. Countries are homogenous, they're monocultural by definition, most of them are. Cities everywhere, even the most homogenous countries, are multicultural and diverse. That means creativity, friction, excitement, innovation, entrepreneurship, and those are all qualities that let cities heal themselves, even under conditions where they don't control the economy. Detroit's doing it now. It's become a hipster city. There are a lot of small tech firms moving there. There are a lot of young hipsters moving in. There are a lot of black community organizations.
Well, that goes back to the question of, I think you called it glocalism, because part of what drives some of that cultural pride and cultural excitement is a sense of the local. How does that relate to your ruling the world idea? 2
things have changed. The first is a weird inversion of the relationship between states and cities with respect to progressive rights issues. All through the 19th and 20th century, for example, the government of the United States stood for the great universal rights goals, and states and cities were backwaters that had to be opposed. That's what the Civil War was about. That's what the civil rights struggle was about. But in the last 50 years, increasingly, cities wave the banner of rights, whether it's gay rights, whether it's the rights for the voiceless, and the national government, controlled by backward interests, often is the backward one. So instead of cities being parochial, it's states that are parochial and cities that are cosmopolitan. And that word, I'm not going back to the polis, I'm going forward to the cosmopolis. And that comes to the second solution. Cities can't do it alone. They have to do it together. They have to work together. When you work not polis by polis, but work through the cosmopolis, work through localities that join together globally, then you get this strange new hybrid called glocality, in which you have all the vitality and creativity and strength and diversity of local cities, but working together across the world to solve common problems. And for me, the Global Mayors Parliament is a way to give a voice to glocality at the global end, because cities already have a powerful voice at the local end.
Dr. Ben Barber's new book is If Mayors Ruled the World. We'll have a link at our website.